The city was alive with noise and movement, but for one boy it was just another long night without a place to call home. He walked slowly along the cold sidewalk, his thin jacket doing little to protect him from the biting wind. Around him, bright lights from tall buildings lit up the streets and cars rushed past as if everyone had somewhere important to go. He had nowhere to go, nowhere he truly belonged. He was just another face in the crowd that nobody noticed. His stomach growled, a painful reminder that he hadn't eaten since yesterday. He stopped near a bakery where the smell of fresh bread floated into the air. For a moment he stood there, breathing in deeply, wishing he could walk in and buy something warm. But he had no money, not even a coin. The only thing he had was a small backpack with a few old clothes inside, and that was all his life had become. Moving from one corner of the city to another, looking for food, looking for shelter, looking for kindness. The boy had been living on the streets for months. People often assumed that being homeless made someone angry, bitter, or careless. But he wasn't like that. He still believed in goodness. When he saw another child crying, he would stop and try to comfort them. When he found a piece of food he couldn't finish, he would share it with an older man who often sat outside the train station. Life had been unkind to him, but his heart had not grown hard. Deep inside, he carried a strange kind of hope, one that told him tomorrow could be better. That night, the wind felt colder than usual. He pulled his jacket tighter around him and looked for a place to rest. He knew the spots, under the bridge where other homeless people gathered, behind the bus station where it was quieter, or the public library steps that at least offered light and some safety. But he also knew those places could be dangerous at times. Older men sometimes shouted at him, warning him to stay away from their territory. Groups of teenagers laughed and threw things at him when they saw him trying to sleep. He had to be careful, always alert. As he walked down a narrow street, he noticed a mother holding her daughter's hand. The little girl had dropped her toy, and without thinking, he bent down, picked it up, and ran to hand it back. The mother looked surprised, maybe even a little nervous at first, but when she saw his gentle smile, she softly thanked him. The girl clutched the toy and whispered a tiny thank you too. That moment warmed him, even more than a meal would have. Small gestures like that made him feel like he still mattered. He continued walking, and eventually he found himself near an alleyway. He thought it might be a quiet place to sit down and rest his legs. As he stepped inside, the noise of the busy streets seemed to fade away. It was darker, colder, but at least it was hidden. He leaned against the wall, pulled his knees to his chest, and closed his eyes. For a few minutes he just sat there trying to ignore the ache in his stomach and the sharp chill in his bones. But then, something strange reached his ears. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper or a soft cry. He lifted his head and listened carefully. The sound came again, this time clearer. It was the sound of someone whimpering, muffled as if they were trying not to be heard. His heart began to beat faster. He knew the city had many dark corners, and he had seen things before that made him uneasy. He debated with himself. Should he go and see what it was, or should he stay out of it? Curiosity won. Carefully, he stood up and moved deeper into the alley. What he saw made him freeze. At the far end of the alley, near an old abandoned building, 2 men were struggling with a girl. She looked young, maybe not much younger than him, but she was clearly terrified. One man held her by the arm while the other covered her mouth. She tried to fight, kicking and twisting, but they were too strong. His breath caught in his chest. For a second he felt powerless, but something inside him whispered that he couldn't just walk away. He had seen enough sadness in life to know when someone needed help. He quickly stepped back into the shadows, his mind racing. Who was this girl? Why were they taking her? He remembered seeing her face before, on posters pasted near bus stops and on television screens in the stores he sometimes stood outside of. The city had been searching for a missing girl. Could it really be her? The millionaire's daughter everyone was talking about? His thoughts swirled, but one thing was clear. She was in danger, and nobody else was there to help. The boy's hands shook slightly, but not from the cold this time. It was fear of what those men could do to him if they saw him, fear of getting caught in something much bigger than himself. But alongside the fear there was courage. He had nothing to lose. He was already invisible to the world. Maybe this was his chance to do something that mattered. Something good. Slowly he moved back and hid behind a dumpster, watching every move carefully. The men dragged the girl toward the door of the abandoned building. She struggled harder, her muffled cries echoing in the narrow alley. His heart ached for her. He remembered the nights when he felt helpless, when nobody came to rescue him from hunger or cold. He couldn't let her feel the same way. He had no plan, no weapon, no one to call. All he had was himself. The city outside went on as usual. People laughing, cars honking, life rushing forward. But inside that alley, something different was unfolding. A boy who had nothing but his heart was about to face a choice that could change not just his night, but his entire life. He didn't know how, and he didn't know what would happen next. All he knew was that he was not going to walk away. The boy stood frozen in the shadows of the alley, his back pressed against the cold brick wall. His heart beat so loudly in his chest that he worried the men at the end of the alley might hear it. The muffled cries of the girl grew sharper, and the sight of her struggling filled him with both fear and determination. He had never been in such a situation before, never imagined he would witness something so terrifying. But he knew he could not simply walk away. The men were big, stronger than him by far. They had the girl tightly in their grip, dragging her toward the old door of the abandoned building. The boy swallowed hard and thought quickly. He had nothing to defend himself with, nothing except his wits. He crouched low and slipped further back into the shadows, trying to stay unseen. His mind raced with questions. How could he get her away from them? Could he run for help? But if he left, she might disappear forever. The city outside of the alley was still alive with cars and voices, but here it felt like another world. Silent, tense, dangerous. The boy remembered the times when he himself had needed someone's kindness, someone's protection. Most people had ignored him, walked past him as if he didn't exist. He couldn't do that to her. She was scared, alone, and in danger. He had to do something, no matter how impossible it seemed. He edged closer, careful not to make a sound. His feet moved slowly, each step measured. He ducked behind a stack of wooden crates, peeking out just enough to see the men push the girl through the doorway. His stomach turned. Once inside, they could lock the door and she would be trapped. He had only moments to act. His body trembled, but he forced himself to think. If he rushed forward recklessly, they would catch him. He needed to be clever. Looking around, his eyes caught sight of loose stones on the ground. He picked up one, feeling its rough edges press into his palm. He glanced back at the crates, then at a broken metal pipe lying nearby. An idea began to form. He might not be strong, but he could create a distraction. If he could trick them into looking the other way, he could buy a moment just enough to reach her. Taking a deep breath, he threw the stone toward the far side of the alley. It clattered loudly against a rusty trash can. Both men paused, their heads snapping toward the sound. The girl tried to pull away in that brief moment, but one of the men tightened his grip and dragged her inside. The boy's chance was slipping away. He picked up the pipe and hit it against the crates, making another sharp noise before ducking back into the shadows. The men cursed under their breath, confused, and one of them stepped back out of the doorway to check the alley. The boy's heart pounded. He pressed himself against the wall, holding his breath as the man scanned the darkness. Seconds felt like hours. Finally, the man shook his head and muttered something before going back inside. The boy knew he couldn't wait any longer. If they locked the door, it would be over. Summoning every ounce of courage, he crept forward, staying low to the ground until he reached the side of the building. The door was old and cracked, the wood splintering near the hinges. Through a small gap, he could see the glow of a dim light inside. He crouched down and peered through. The girl was tied to a chair now, her eyes wide with fear as the men argued. He couldn't hear everything they said, but he caught enough to understand. They were planning to demand money for her release. His chest tightened. This was worse than he imagined. They were dangerous, and they weren't going to let her go easily. He backed away from the door, his mind racing. Running for the police crossed his thoughts again, but he quickly pushed it aside. By the time he explained, by the time anyone came, the men could move her to another place. He couldn't take that risk. It had to be now. It had to be him. Carefully, he tried the side window of the building. The glass was cracked and dirty, but it moved when he pushed. Slowly, silently, he lifted it just enough to slip through. He landed inside with barely a sound, crouching low behind a stack of broken furniture. From there, he could see the girl clearly. She noticed him almost instantly, her eyes widening in surprise and hope. He put a finger to his lips, signaling her to stay quiet. She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. The men continued their conversation, pacing back and forth, distracted by their own greed. The boy scanned the room, looking for anything he could use. In the corner, he spotted an old rope, some empty bottles, and a pile of scrap wood. His mind worked quickly. If he could cause a big enough distraction, maybe he could untie her before they noticed. He picked up one of the bottles and gently rolled it across the floor to the far side of the room. It knocked against the wall, making a sharp clinking noise. One of the men turned immediately, frowning. "What was that?" he muttered, walking toward the sound. The other men followed, their backs now turned to the girl. The boy seized the moment. Moving as quickly and quietly as he could, he rushed to the girl. His hands shook as he worked at the knots, the rough rope biting into his fingers. She whispered something, her voice trembling, but he whispered back, "Stay quiet, I'll get you out." The knots were tight, harder than he expected. But finally, one came loose, then another. His heart soared with each piece of rope that fell away. But then the sound of footsteps made him freeze. The men were coming back. He wasn't fast enough. He glanced around desperately, spotting the pipe he had carried in. He grabbed it and held it tightly. His legs felt weak, his palms sweaty, but he stood ready. If they saw him, he would have no choice but to fight. Just as the men turned back toward the center of the room, another sound came from outside, a siren in the distance. The men stiffened, distracted again. They looked at each other nervously, muttering about whether someone had already called the police. The boy used their hesitation to pull the last rope free. The girl stumbled to her feet and he quickly helped her stay balanced. "Come on," he whispered urgently. Together they slipped back toward the open window. The girl climbed out first, her movements clumsy but desperate. The boy followed, his heart thundering in his chest. As soon as his feet hit the ground outside, he grabbed her hand and ran. They didn't look back. The alley stretched ahead of them, dark and endless, but it was their only chance. Behind them, the angry shouts of the men echoed. They had been discovered. The boy tightened his grip on the girl's hand and pushed himself to run faster than he ever had before. His lungs burned, his legs screamed in pain, but he didn't stop. He knew the city better than they did. He knew the shortcuts, the hidden paths, the places where the streets twisted like a maze. They darted through narrow passages, climbed over low fences, and weaved through back alleys. The girl stumbled a few times, but he pulled her up each time, whispering, "Don't stop. Keep going." The night air bit at their faces, but fear pushed them forward. Every corner they turned felt like a new chance, every step further from danger. Finally, after what felt like forever, they reached a quieter street. The boy slowed down, his chest heaving. The girl leaned against the wall, gasping for air, her face pale but determined. For a moment, they both just stood there, breathing hard, their hearts racing. The boy listened carefully. No footsteps, no shouting. They had escaped, at least for now. The girl looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and disbelief. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. He gave her a small, tired smile. "You're safe," he said softly, though he wasn't sure how safe they really were. He knew the danger wasn't over. The men would be looking for them, and they couldn't stay here for long. Still, in that brief pause, a bond was formed. He was a boy who had nothing, and she was a girl who had lost her freedom. But in that moment, they were simply two kids clinging to each other, finding strength where they least expected it. And though the night was far from over, something inside the boy told him this was only the beginning of a journey that would change everything. The boy and the girl stood in the quiet street, their breathing heavy, their bodies trembling from the run. The boy glanced around, making sure no one was following them. The shadows of the night stretched across the walls and the street was almost empty. The girl clutched his hand tightly, as if afraid that if she let go, the nightmare would return. He looked at her, noticing how frightened she was, but also how strong she seemed in the middle of all this chaos. "Are you okay?" he whispered, his voice low, careful not to attract attention. She nodded, though her eyes were still filled with fear. Her hair was messy, her clothes torn, but she was alive. And that was all that mattered in that moment. He knew they couldn't stay there. The men who had taken her would not give up so easily. They would be searching, and the city was big, but not big enough to keep them hidden forever. He squeezed her hand gently, urging her to move again. "We have to keep going," he said softly. She nodded once more, and together they started walking quickly down the dim street. The boy thought hard about where to go. He had no home, no family, no safe place to hide. He knew the corners of the city that most people ignored, alleys, abandoned lots, small shops that closed early. But none of them were truly safe. He needed somewhere the men wouldn't think to look, at least for now. As he led her through the streets, he kept glancing behind, listening for footsteps or voices, but all he heard was the sound of their own breathing and the occasional car passing by. After several blocks, they reached a narrow passageway between two buildings. It smelled faintly of garbage, but it was dark and hidden. He guided her inside, and they crouched behind a pile of old boxes. The girl hugged her knees, trying to calm herself. The boy looked at her, wondering what to say. He wasn't used to talking much. Most people never wanted to hear what he had to say anyway, but he felt the need to give her some comfort. "You're safe for now," he told her quietly. "I won't let them hurt you." Her eyes filled with tears, and she whispered, "Thank you." Her voice shook, but it carried deep sincerity. The boy gave a small nod, unsure how to respond. He didn't need thanks. He just knew he couldn't have turned away. For a few minutes they sat in silence, listening to the distant hum of the city. But the boy's mind wouldn't rest. He knew this hiding spot wouldn't last long. The kidnappers would search everywhere. The posters of the girl's missing face flashed in his memory. He had seen them so many times, never imagining he would actually meet her like this. She wasn't just some picture on a wall, she was real, scared and depending on him. "We need to find the police," he finally said, his voice steady. "They can help you." The girl nodded, though hesitation flickered in her eyes. "What if they don't believe us?" she asked softly. The boy understood her fear. He too had faced doubt and mistrust so many times. People saw a homeless boy and assumed the worst. He remembered the times shopkeepers had accused him of stealing when all he did was walk by. The times people crossed the street to avoid him. The police might not trust him either, but he couldn't let fear stop them. "We'll make them listen," he said firmly. "You'll tell them what happened. They'll believe you." The girl studied him, then slowly nodded. There was trust in her eyes now, something that gave him strength. He stood up, brushing the dirt from his clothes. "Come on," he said. "We have to move before they find us." They slipped out of the alley and began walking again, sticking to the shadows. The city was quieter now as the night grew deeper. Neon signs flickered in the distance, and the faint sound of music drifted from a bar down the street. The boy led her past it quickly, not wanting to draw attention. His focus was sharp, every sense alert for danger. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind them. The boy froze, pulling the girl into a dark corner. They pressed against the wall, holding their breath. Two men walked by, their voices low and angry. The boy recognized them instantly. It was the kidnappers. His stomach knotted with fear. They were still searching, and they were close. He held the girl's hand tightly, silently praying they wouldn't look their way. The men passed, their footsteps fading into the distance. The boy waited a few more moments before whispering, "Come on, we have to hurry." They slipped out of the corner and moved in the opposite direction, their pace quicker now. The danger was real, and it was closing in. After several more blocks, they reached the edge of a busy street. Cars moved steadily, and a few people walked along the sidewalks. The boy felt a small wave of relief. The kidnappers would be less likely to make a move here, not with so many eyes around. He guided the girl across the street toward a small convenience store that was still open. The bright light spilling out from its windows gave him a sense of safety. Inside, the warm air wrapped around them, a sharp contrast to the chill of the night. The shopkeeper looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly at the boy's ragged clothes, but he said nothing. The girl stayed close to the boy, her hand gripping his tightly. For a moment, they just stood there, surrounded by rows of food and drinks. The boy's stomach twisted with hunger, but he pushed the feeling aside. The girl came first. He spotted a payphone near the back of the store. His heart raced. This was their chance. He led the girl toward it, digging into his pocket for coins. He had only a few, barely enough for a call. He picked up the receiver and dialed the emergency number. His hand shook as he held it to his ear. A voice answered. The boy swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I found the girl," he said quickly. "The one who's missing. She's with me." The men who took her are still looking. Please, you have to come. The operator asked questions and the boy did his best to answer. He gave the street name, the store they were in. He glanced at the girl, who nodded and whispered her name, confirming her identity. The boy repeated it into the phone, his voice urgent. The operator promised help was on the way and told them to stay put. Relief washed over him, but fear lingered. What if the kidnappers found them before the police arrived? He hung up the phone and turned to the girl. We have to stay here until they come, he told her. She nodded, her eyes wide but hopeful. Minutes dragged by slowly. The boy kept watch, his body tense, ready to move if danger appeared. The girl sat beside him, her head resting against the wall. She was exhausted, but she stayed awake, clutching his sleeve tightly. They waited together, two strangers bound by fear and courage. Finally, the sound of sirens filled the air. The boy's chest tightened with relief. Through the store window, flashing lights appeared, painting the street in red and blue. Police cars pulled up and officers rushed inside. The girl stood, her face lighting up with hope, and she called out to them. The officers quickly surrounded her, asking questions, checking to make sure she was unharmed. The boy stepped back, suddenly unsure. He had done what he came to do. She was safe now. But as he stood there, he felt the weight of every eye turning toward him. Some of the officers looked at him with suspicion, their gazes sharp. He lowered his head, his heart sinking. He had feared this moment. Would they believe him? Or would they see only a homeless boy who didn't belong? The girl noticed his hesitation. She stepped forward quickly, pointing at him. He saved me, she said firmly. Her voice carried strength despite her exhaustion. He's the reason I'm here. Please, listen to him. The officers paused, their expressions softening. The boy looked up, meeting their eyes. He saw disbelief, but also respect beginning to form. Slowly, he explained what had happened. The alley, the men, the escape. The girl confirmed everything, her voice steady. The officers nodded, taking notes, their suspicion easing. As more police arrived, some went out searching for the kidnappers, while others escorted the girl to safety. The boy stood quietly, unsure of what would happen to him now. He felt invisible again, standing in the bright lights of the store. But then the girl turned to him, her eyes shining with gratitude. She reached out and took his hand once more, holding it tightly. You're not alone anymore, she whispered. The words struck deep into his heart. For the first time in a long time, he felt seen, truly seen. The night was not over, and the future was uncertain, but he knew something had changed forever. The boy who had once been invisible had stepped into the light, and nothing would ever be the same. The flashing lights outside the small store painted the street in shades of red and blue. People had gathered on the sidewalk, whispering and pointing, their curiosity drawing them closer. Inside, the girl stood surrounded by police officers, answering questions as best as she could. Her voice was shaky, but her eyes stayed steady, glancing now and then at the boy who had saved her. She refused to let him be forgotten in the chaos. The boy stood near the corner of the store, quiet and unsure of his place. He watched the officers move quickly, speaking into radios, writing notes, making calls. He felt small among them, as if at any moment they might turn and ask him to leave. The girl, though, never let that happen. She made sure to keep him in the conversation, her hand pointing toward him whenever the officers asked how she had gotten free. He's the one, she told them again and again. He helped me. He saved me. Some of the officers gave the boy long looks, measuring him with their eyes. His torn jacket, his dirty shoes, his tired face. All of it told them a story, but not the whole truth. The boy's heart raced with worry. Would they believe her? Would they trust him? He shifted uncomfortably, his hands tightening around the straps of his old backpack. He didn't know what to expect. Finally, one officer approached him. He was older, his face lined with years of work, but his eyes were calm. Son, the officer said softly, we need you to tell us everything you saw. The boy nodded quickly, his throat dry. He took a deep breath and explained it all. The alley, the cries, the men dragging her into the building, the escape. His words tumbled out, sometimes rushed, sometimes slow, but always honest. The officer listened carefully, not interrupting, just letting the boy speak. When he finished, the officer gave a small nod. You were very brave, the man said quietly. Not many would have done what you did. The boy lowered his eyes, embarrassed by the praise. He hadn't thought of it as bravery. He had just seen someone in need and acted. That was all. But hearing those words brought a warmth to his chest he hadn't felt in a long time. More officers came and went. They asked the girl to describe the men again, to confirm details. She clung to the boy's side as she spoke, her small hand gripping his arm tightly. She didn't want him to be pushed aside or forgotten. When one of the officers suggested taking her to a waiting car, she shook her head. "He's coming too," she said firmly. "I'm not leaving without him." The officers exchanged glances, uncertain at first, but her determination was clear. Finally, they agreed. The boy was guided outside, past the curious crowd, and into the back of a police car with the girl. She leaned close to him, her voice a whisper. "It's okay," she said, though she herself was trembling. "They'll help us now." The ride to the station felt like a dream. The boy pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the window, watching the city lights blur past. He thought about the night, how quickly everything had changed. Just hours ago, he had been another invisible figure wandering the streets. Now he was here, sitting beside the daughter of a man whose face he had seen on newspapers and television. It didn't feel real. When they arrived, the station was busy, filled with voices, phones ringing, officers moving from one desk to another. The girl was immediately taken to a separate room where more people, officers, maybe even detectives, waited to speak with her. She looked back at the boy before stepping inside, her eyes full of trust. He gave her a small nod, letting her know he wasn't going anywhere. The boy was led to a different room. It was smaller, quieter. An officer brought him a cup of water, which he accepted gratefully. He sat at the table, his fingers wrapped tightly around the cup. For a long while, no one spoke to him. He just sat there wondering what would happen next. His mind drifted to his life outside. The cold nights, the empty stomach, the endless walking. Would he return to that when this was over? Or would tonight truly change something? Finally, the door opened. A man in a suit entered, carrying a folder. He introduced himself as a detective and sat across from the boy. His tone was calm but serious. He asked the boy to tell his story again, this time with every detail he could remember. The boy did, his voice steady, though inside he still felt nervous. The detective wrote notes, occasionally asking small questions to clarify. When the boy finished, the detective closed the folder and leaned back. "You know," he said slowly, "what you did tonight was dangerous, but it saved her life. If you hadn't been there..." He didn't finish the thought, but the boy understood. The detective's eyes softened. "You have courage. That's not something we see every day." The boy nodded, unsure what to say. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt tired, hungry, and overwhelmed. But hearing those words gave him a sense of pride he hadn't known before. Hours passed. The girl's family was contacted, and word spread quickly that she had been found. Reporters gathered outside the station, their cameras flashing as soon as the news broke. The boy caught glimpses of them through the window, their eager faces pressed close to the glass, searching for a story. He shrank back, not wanting their attention. He had lived his life in the shadows, and the thought of being in the spotlight frightened him. Then the moment arrived. The doors of the station opened, and a man rushed inside. He was tall, well-dressed, his face pale with worry but bright with hope. The boy recognized him instantly from the newspapers. The girl's father, the millionaire. His eyes searched the room until they landed on the girl. In an instant, he crossed the space and gathered her into his arms. She clung to him, sobbing, and he held her tightly, whispering words of comfort. It was a reunion filled with emotion, one that made even the officers pause with respect. The boy watched from the corner, his chest tightening. He felt happy for her, deeply happy, but also aware of the distance between their worlds. She had a family who loved her, who would fight to protect her. He had no one. The thought stung, but he tried to push it aside. This was her moment, and he didn't want to take anything from it. But the girl didn't forget him. She pulled back from her father just enough to point toward the boy. Her voice, though soft, carried clearly. "He saved me," she said again, her eyes shining. "If it wasn't for him, I wouldn't be here." The millionaire turned, his gaze following her hand. His eyes met the boy's, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other. The man's expression shifted, first surprise, then something deeper. Gratitude, respect, even awe. He walked slowly toward the boy, his daughter's hand still in his. When he reached him, he paused, then placed a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. "Thank you," he said simply. His voice was thick with emotion. "You gave me back my daughter. I can never repay you for that, The boy swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. He shrugged slightly, his voice quiet. I just couldn't let them hurt her. The man's eyes softened. Most would have looked away, but you didn't. You're braver than many grown men I've known. Reporters outside clamored for details, their voices muffled through the walls. Cameras flashed, eager for pictures. But inside the station, it was just a father, a daughter, and a boy who had risked everything. For the first time in his life, the boy felt truly seen, not as a burden, not as someone unwanted, but as someone who mattered. The girl's father insisted the boy stay close as they prepared to leave the station. He comes with us, the girl said firmly when an officer suggested otherwise. The father agreed without hesitation. The boy was guided through the doors, and instantly the cameras exploded with light. Questions were shouted, names called out, but the boy barely heard them. All he could focus on was the girl's small hand holding his tightly, refusing to let go. That night, the boy didn't sleep under a bridge or behind a store. He sat in the back seat of a car, warm for the first time in months as the city lights passed outside. The girl leaned against him, her head resting lightly on his shoulder while her father sat across from them, watching with quiet thoughtfulness. The boy didn't know what the future held, but something told him that his life, which had once seemed so empty, was about to change in ways he never imagined. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe in tomorrow, not just as another day to survive, but as the beginning of something new. And though fear and doubt still lingered at the edges of his mind, one truth shone brighter than anything else. He was no longer invisible. He had been brave when it mattered most, and now the world finally saw him. The night had finally settled into silence, but the boy's heart still raced. The events of the past hours replayed in his mind like flashes of lightning. The girl who only hours ago had been trapped and terrified now walked beside him in the quiet street. Her steps were unsteady and her face still showed fear, but her eyes also carried something new: trust. She looked at him as if he was her only anchor in a storm she couldn't escape. They had run so far and so fast that their legs ached. The boy led her into a quieter part of the city, where the streetlights flickered weakly and the buildings leaned old and tired. He knew these streets better than anyone. They had been his home, his shelter, and sometimes his prison. Every corner told a story of where he had slept, where he had searched for food, and where he had hidden from people who didn't want to see him. Tonight, for the first time, he wasn't just surviving for himself. He was protecting someone else. The girl pulled her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders. The night air was sharp and her body shook. The boy noticed and quickly slipped off his worn hoodie. It wasn't much. The fabric was torn in places, but it was warmer than what she had. He held it out to her. At first, she hesitated, but then she accepted it, her voice soft as she whispered, "Thank you." He shrugged, trying to act like it was nothing, but inside he felt something stir. No one had ever needed him like this before. No one had ever looked at him with gratitude in their eyes. It gave him a strength he didn't know he had. They found a spot behind an old bakery where the air carried the faint scent of bread. The boy had slept there many times, and he knew the shop owner left out stale loaves for strays. Tonight, the crate by the back door held half a loaf, and he picked it up, brushing away the dirt. Breaking it in half, he handed one piece to her. She took it with trembling hands, chewing slowly as if every bite was heavier than it should be. He ate his half quickly, used to swallowing food without thought, but tonight he noticed how she ate. She wasn't used to hunger the way he was. He wondered about her life before this. Warm meals, soft beds, people who cared for her. After a while, her voice broke the silence. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. Her tone wasn't suspicious, more curious, like she couldn't understand why someone like him would risk everything for someone like her. The boy looked at her, unsure of what to say at first. He could have told her the truth, that he didn't even fully know why. That when he saw her in danger, something inside him wouldn't let him walk away. Instead, he simply said, "Because you needed someone." She stared at him, eyes glistening in the dim light, and for a moment, no words passed between them. In that silence, something stronger than words formed, a bond neither of them expected. But peace never lasted long in the boy's world. Footsteps echoed faintly from the street, voices carrying in the distance. His body tensed immediately. They couldn't stay here. The men who had taken her would be searching, and he knew they wouldn't stop easily. He motioned for her to stand, and though she was tired, she trusted him enough to follow. They moved again, weaving through back streets, avoiding the main roads where lights and people might give them away. Each shadow became their shield, each corner a chance to hide. The boy's instincts, sharpened by years of living unseen, guided them through the night. Hours passed like this until finally the girl's strength gave out. Her legs buckled and she sank to the ground, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't keep running." The boy crouched beside her, unsure what to do. He was used to pushing himself, used to pain and exhaustion, but she wasn't. She was from a different world. He knew she couldn't endure much more. He looked around, searching desperately, and then spotted an old church at the end of the street. Its tall doors were shut, but the soft glow of light spilled from one of the windows. Churches were sometimes kind places, he thought. Maybe they could rest there. He helped her to her feet and guided her to the church. The heavy door creaked open and they slipped inside. The air smelled of old wood and candles. Rows of benches stretched before them, empty except for the quiet hum of silence. They settled in the back, hidden in the shadows. The girl curled up against the bench, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. Within minutes she was asleep, her breathing slow and steady. The boy sat beside her, watching the flicker of candlelight dance across the walls. His own eyes burned with tiredness, but he stayed awake, keeping guard. He knew the world outside wasn't safe, and for the first time, he carried the weight of someone else's safety on his shoulders. As the night gave way to dawn, light spilled through the stained glass windows, painting the floor with colors. The girl stirred awake, her face soft in the morning glow. For a moment, she almost looked peaceful. Then her eyes filled with worry again. "They'll find us, won't they?" she asked quietly. The boy nodded slowly. "Maybe, but we'll stay ahead of them." She studied him, her lips pressing together. "You've lived like this before." "Hiding, running." He gave a small shrug. "It's all I've ever known." Her eyes filled with something deeper, sadness, maybe even guilt. She had glimpsed his world now, and it was nothing like hers. She realized he hadn't chosen this life. Life had chosen it for him. Yet here he was, risking it all to save her. Before either of them could say more, the church doors opened. A man in a simple coat stepped in, his footsteps echoing. He looked like the caretaker, older with gentle eyes. His gaze fell on the two of them, and for a moment the boy's heart stopped. Would he throw them out? Call someone? But instead the man simply walked closer, his voice calm. "You both look like you've had a hard night." The boy stiffened, ready to defend, but the girl quickly spoke, her voice trembling but polite. "Please, we just needed somewhere safe." The caretaker's eyes softened. He nodded slowly. "You're safe here. Rest as long as you need." The boy couldn't believe it. Kindness was rare in his life. Suspicion was what he expected, anger even more so. Yet here was a man who offered them safety without asking questions. It was almost too much to trust. Still, he allowed himself to ease just a little. For the first time in a long time, he felt like they weren't completely alone. The hours in the church passed quietly. The girl regained some of her strength, eating a small meal the caretaker offered. The boy stayed cautious but grateful. He knew they couldn't stay forever, but for now it was a pause in the storm. When they finally stepped back outside, the world felt heavier again. The boy could sense it. The men were still out there hunting. He didn't know how much longer they could keep running. But one thing he did know, he wouldn't let her go. Not now, not ever. She had become part of his fight, part of his reason to keep going. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, the boy understood something he never had before. Sometimes life gave you a chance to be more than what the world expected. Sometimes, even when you had nothing, you could still give everything. And that, he realized, could change everything. Not just for him, but for her too. The journey was far from over, but step by step, they would face it together. And in the quiet strength of that bond, something new was being written. A story neither of them had ever imagined, but both desperately needed.